Welcome to the SportsPro Podcast.
Hi everyone, and welcome once again to the SportsPro Podcast. My name is Owen Connolly. I'm the editor-at-large at SportsPro. Hope you're well. We are going to be talking about golf this week with the Masters coming up belatedly at the Augusta National. And in the process of putting together this week's lineup, we've also unwittingly created some kind of sports industry podcast supergroup. Our first guest is Richard Gillis, the founder of the Unofficial Partner Podcast, and it should be noted for the purposes of this conversation, author of The Captain Myth, a book about Ryder Cup golf and leadership. Hi, Richard.
Hello there. I was wondering why you asked me, actually. That suddenly makes sense.
I wonder why I ask you every time, but here we are. And we also have the host of, among other things, the Captain's Table podcast, no relation, where he has spoken to his share of top golfers. He's also a seasoned sports sponsorship executive and consultant. He is, of course, Giles Morgan. Hi, Giles.
Hi, Owen. It's great to be part of this supergroup. I'm hoping if it's the travelling Wilburys, I can be the late Tom Petty.
Well, I mean, that's
one for our millennial audience.
He only died a couple of years ago.
Anyway, we are obviously approaching a little later than scheduled. One of the highlights of the golf calendar. This sport is going to be venturing deep into the democratic heartlands of Georgia and off to Augusta for the Masters in November. I mean, before we get into everything else, there's a lot to talk about with golf in 2020. But what is it about the Masters? Just, you know, as a brand, and you know, obviously it has its qualities that are more problematic. It has its kind of fastidious insistence on tradition. There's a lot to it. But what is it about the Masters with golf? Richard, why don't you field that one first?
It's to do with spring, which is strange to say. We're talking about November, but it's normally it feels like the start of summer, and it goes back to the way in which the course and the event is presented. As you say, it's incredibly sort of controlled, and over the years there's been innovation there, but actually the thing looks very, if you go back and look at them from the sort of 60s and the 70s, they're the same. It's exactly the same event. So there is a nostalgia there, which is always good in golf to push that button. But it's also it tends to be exciting, which not always, by the way. There's been some really tedious ones, but in the sort of scale of the Masters, the major championships, 4 of them a year. This is the first of the year, and it's the same place every year. It's the same, it's always green, it's always sunny. You got the flowers, all of that stuff going on, and it's just something that you sort of look forward to, and it's a kickoff to the summer. Really, that's why I like it anyway.
Giles?
Well, Richard said it all, but I think the other thing is that the Masters represents. I always feel there are sort of 2 forms of golf. There's the kind of perfection, manicured, American-style golf, of which Augusta is the ultimate, and particularly in spring, it looks perfect. You almost don't want to touch it. It looks so perfect. And then you have the other great Open Championship, the Open Championship, which is wild and woolly golf, real golf on links, often played in Scotland or in the north of England. And I think that juxtaposition, because they are the 2 senior majors, really. I know the other 2 would beg to differ, but the Open is the oldest, and Augusta is probably the one because of the regular playing always at Augusta. They're etched most on our memories, and I think they represent the 2 sides of golf, and it is very, very special.
I mean, we obviously didn't have the Open this year because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we are, we're certainly not heading into high summer, not here and not in the American South either. But does that put a different kind of status on this year's event? Does it have to, grab the conversation for golf? Is it just a case of will the golf audience find this tournament either way? Richard, what do we think?
I think certainly the golf audience will. I mean, it'll be unusual, it'll be strange and weird because there's no crowds there. It'll be quite interesting for that reason, actually. It'll be, for golf nerds. Whether it reaches out beyond that core group, I don't know, actually. And the question for the sport and, so for each event, the Masters is the top of the shop when it comes to golf events. Most people outside of the sort of core and people who define themselves as core golf fans, if anyone does do that, they're the ones they will, catch hold of. The problem and the challenge is actually bringing people in from the sort of wider group, which the Masters probably does and the Open probably does. The Ryder Cup certainly does. But then beyond that, that's where the problem lies. And that's not just golf specific, but it's obviously you're then into sort of big eventer territory. And you're saying, well, who's watching? How do they sort of evolve this event? And I think one of the interesting things about the Masters particularly, and also the Open, but also golf, is this sort of they're wrestling or balancing the past and the future. So they're trying to sort of evolve over time whilst also telling the backstory. And that is sometimes challenging. Sometimes it works. People like, and I'm sure Giles can talk to the sort of sponsor view of golf in terms of like the traditional values, blah, blah, blah. However, it is also gets you into, some really awful comms nonsense around, and particularly around the Masters, which at the moment, and particularly this year is it's quite an interesting place. So I think there's a sort of how it evolves. It's always been about control, particularly around television. They've always been very tightly controlled. And how you sort of establish or keep that control in a sort of in a social media environment. So it's quite difficult. And I'd say they've done it again. The Masters have done it well over the sort of what we might define as the sort of first era of social media. Their app and the way in which the event looks across digital is consistent, and it looks really good, and it's the Masters. So it's done lots of things well, I would suggest.
And Giles, how will that translate to this year when you do have that incongruity as well, in terms of the calendar and the patrons being absent and all the rest of it?
Well, I think as Richard says, that it's going to be an anomaly, and therefore it's interesting because it's an anomaly. But because we've been starved by so much sport during 2020, that I think that people are, for those that like golf, they're going to be avidly tuning in. One, because they're desperate to see a major, and secondly, because what will it look like without the packed galleries? So I think, particularly with the recent news that a vaccine might have been found, etc., one is hoping probably that in the next year, certainly 18 months, that some sort of normalcy will return, not just to sport and the ability for sports to put themselves on, whatever those restrictions are, but that sense of routine and calendar that we're all sports are defined by, which is we know where we're at. As Richard said very succinctly, you know where you are at the Masters. It's sort of the start of the summer swing for golf, and it heralds the rest of the season. This one is anomalous. Thank goodness it's on, because it gives us all something. For those of us who like watching golf, the Masters is exciting. And I've also felt that of all the sports on television without an audience, both in terms of production values, but also just in terms of how it looks the least, for me, weird. Maybe not, obviously, the Open Championship when they're walking up 18 with those giant galleries. You can't replicate that, but actually how they play golf looks quite familiar. And therefore the Masters, that will look familiar enough. But I think we all do, that this is the anomalous year, that things can start to reboot, whatever rebooting looks like, and that the routine of calendar in 21, possibly not, but certainly by 22, that we get back to the schedule, even if it's a new norm.
For all that disruption to the calendar, and perhaps even in the face of all of it, what have we learned about golf in 2020? It's a sport that behaves differently. It has a different cohort of fans. It's an individual sport, and you don't have the same kind of fanatical attachment for the most part that you would get in team sports and and in certain sports that maybe have different demographics. What have you made, Giles, of the kind of efforts to fill the void first of all, and then kind of compete in what is a very different media landscape because you have so much going on. You have sports that are not used to competing with each other for media attention that are suddenly sharing airtime. What do you think this sport's learned about itself?
Well, funny enough, I think golf has had a relatively good war, as they used to say. That certainly in terms of participation, looking at the numbers, participation in golf because of COVID has gone up. People desperate to get out. People, until certainly in the UK, the lockdown allowed people to play golf, or there was a big chunk when people were allowed to play golf, no longer. But the numbers both in the UK and US have been huge, a real resurgence of people playing. And of course, that then creates interest in the professional game. It's interesting noticing Topgolf has had an enormous effect on the golf market in terms of bringing new golfers in, particularly in the US and other markets. That all contributes to a broader interest. And also the social media platforms, a lot of the players, particularly the American players, have really embraced social media and maybe putting a new lens to the game, which is less fastidious and old school and a little bit more contemporary. So as a result, in the round, golf has been able to play professionally. I think the European Tour have given it a real go, despite the disappointment of having to postpone Ryder Cup. They've put on events and they've tried to make things a little bit more interesting, experiment, look at new formats and audiences. You then have people playing more, which then translates into people watching more, because golf is very unique in terms of that participation and fandom of the professional game. And then you see these enormous announcements like Callaway's acquisition of Topgolf, shows that there's a market out there. So whilst I have a lot to say about where golf is not commercializing itself properly as a sponsor product, which I'm sure we can come to later on, actually fundamentally, I think the game isn't in a bad place, providing it can capitalize on this weird year.
Yeah, I definitely, the Callaway and Topgolf deal is definitely something I want to get into in a little bit more detail later on, or at least talk about that topic a bit more, because I think it says fascinating things about how golf can develop and how that idea has changed in maybe the last 5 or 10 years. Richard, what have your impressions been in 2020?
Well, I mean, if you go back to the initial, the sort of early lockdown, it was golf, and particularly European Tour, but golf generally, it looked really shaky. There are a lot of the stories that were coming out of it were, players are going to have to go semi-pro, the event calendar is going to collapse, the event holders are going to be, are just going to disappear. And then you've also got the worries of because always these things are in cycles, and you've got the lagging indicators that of television and sponsorship deals that don't get renewed, or they get renewed at a lower level. So I remember doing a podcast with Chubby Chander, the agent, and Nathan Homer, who obviously used to run the commercial at European Tour, and it was a fairly sort of downbeat conversation, talking about, at the same time, you had a challenger in there, the Premier Golf League, which had sort of appeared private equity backed, and that appeared to be, the reading of that. And I remember at the time people saying, well, actually, this has really scared the horses, because, the PGA Tour responded very quickly, very abruptly, tried to put a ring around the players, not even talking about it in public. And then until there was a moment where Rory McIlroy sort of put some distance between him and he said he didn't like where the money was coming from. That threat was real, and it's not gone away. So there is a problem, an inherent problem with golf, which, again, the cliche around COVID is that it sort of accelerated trends, or it's amplified weaknesses. The weakness of golf is it's a fairly tedious week in, week out, 72-hole, 4-day diet of stroke play events, all of which look very similar on telly. And it's very supply driven by sponsors, and it's, the players do fantastically well out of it. But, they are up there with hedge fund managers in terms of having a skill that is overvalued by the economy. So there's a sort of, that's the problem, and that problem hasn't gone away. And they may well, and hopefully I've, got no great desire to see anything, any people lose jobs or whatever, obviously. But that problem hasn't been tackled as far as I can see. The innovation in golf has always been very much on the fringes, We've seen sort of Golf Channel, Golf TV come around, and you've got the Match, which, sort of these one-offs. You've always had that sort of peripheral stuff going on. Everyone knows that the majors are what matters, and in the States you've got people having putts for 10 million quid. All of that gives an impression of a sport that is in incredible robust health. But actually, if you dig below the surface, that isn't true. It's a very uneven picture. There's always been worries about participation rates, which are flat to dipping and in mature markets. We'll come back to Callaway Topgolf, but that you could argue, Giles has put a rosy view on that as a relationship. You could also say that that's Callaway seeking an alternative revenue stream, but we can talk about that later. But there is, as I say, it's a mixed picture. The Masters is a one-off, but actually when you look at the impact of COVID on golf, it's pretty hairy, and they won't be able to sustain the current sort of state of play for too long, and there is a lot of concern, particularly on the European Tour side. The American Tour, feels much more financially secure. The TV numbers are, in terms of the media rights, are enormous, so they'll be okay. But it's the European Tour, and then the other tours as well. The Ladies European Tour, the LPGA, for example. These are areas of the game which I think are under real strain, and that strain's not going to go away.
Well, I agree with it. I hear that, and yet it comes down to the piece that I think that golf's potential is still huge because of the participation, which the numbers are up this year, but that may be an anomaly because of COVID in terms of global participation. But critically, the demographic is a very, very valuable, and it's entirely unmined as a demographic. And as someone who was involved in the sponsorship of the game for a very long time, the correlation between the demographic of the golfer, the golf fan, and how it is not exploited by particularly, as you say, Richard, in America, the television numbers sort of keep the game buoyed and keep it well stacked. But the European Tour, for instance, is sitting on a goldmine of people, of fans who love the game, who watch the game, even if it's only occasionally like the Ryder Cup, that for the sponsorship market is absolutely gold. And golf has never struggled to get sponsors, but then sponsors figure out what are they going to do with the sponsorship, and it hasn't always been pieced together. And for me, what's exciting is that the European Tour in particular, as the second tour, has a great opportunity now to go back to the sponsor market because of the demography of the game, both players and fans, and really, really take it on, because it's been given a bit of a gift this year where it's been reminded that people do love watching and playing golf. And I like the Topgolf piece, and we'll go back to it, because it's another form of it. And it doesn't always have to be about 18-hole, endless 5-hour rounds or whatever it may be. But there are different iterations of the sport. And as we see in cricket and we see in other sports that can keep themselves adapted are the sports that keep moving forward.
You're listening to the SportsPro Podcast.
Let's take another look at that golf audience, and I want to talk about it as a broadcast product and a participation prospect as well. But just to lean into your experience, Giles, on the brand side of things, when you were looking at golf as a sponsorship opportunity, when you were on that side with HSBC and others, what were you looking to exploit there? What was appealing about the buy when you were involved in golf?
Well, it's really interesting because I like probably all of us, but I've been doing this gig for quite a long time, this sponsorship lark. So I was brought up in the time when sponsorship was about a little bit of branding, which was a sort of TV equivalency that gave you a number that sort of justified a sponsorship value. A lot about, particularly in golf, about hospitality and B2B, which was about, top clients. And then other things could be a little bit of pride for businesses, internal engagement. That was the model for sponsorship, which was basically emotion. There was a fit, inverted commas, and then and that could be also about, like the game, golf's values are very pure, and therefore lots of sponsors want to associate with that. And then there was this whole element of golf being about, good hospitality. Well, I've said this publicly before. If I knew then what I know now, the true value of sponsorship lies in the direct to consumer and the ability to talk the language of real customers and real fans. And sport has an incredible advantage that fans are potty about the sports that they love and are happy to interact with sponsors directly if they can dovetail together. And therefore, I don't regret any of the sponsorships that HSBC still do and that I started all those years ago, because they were very demographically fit for purpose and the values were good. But what I do think I left behind was a lot of value, which was return on investment based on, by then engaging with real golf fans all over the world, particularly a portfolio that is now nearly 20 years old. There's a lot of money that HSBC could have made from that to develop a return on investment. And the reason I bang on about this so much, about this data piece, is that it is the power of data and the power of the fan that provides a business model for the sponsorship industry that creates a return on investment, which means that in downturns like the one we're going through right now, or the one I went through, the global financial crisis in 2008-9, when sponsorship was the first thing to get eliminated from the marketeers' war chest because you couldn't make a business case. And now there is a business case. And where I'm bullish on golf is that because it has this very unique sort of triangulation of golfers, golf fans, and those that are sports fans, that is a very big audience that sponsors are very attracted to, let alone all of the sort of the values of the sport. So I'm very strong on golf, as you can tell, but providing they change the language. And if they sell eyeballs as the return on investment, television data, it's not going to stack up.
I mean, you obviously you're involved now as well with PumpJack Data Works, and you've, as you say, you've become quite an evangelist for the power of data to kind of reinvent sponsorship. But has it made
Rich? You've teased me about it before, and I absolutely take it on the chin, because
this is Giles' Damascene conversion, isn't it?
I could barely turn on my computer, let alone understand technical data. But I had enough from what I was doing to make a return on investment, and therefore it paid itself back. But what is really true is that, and where golf is sitting on this gold mine, is that there is a whole lot of new currency that can be traded, which of course brings money back into the game, because Richard is absolutely right. Where the sport needs to innovate, like other sports have done, is in a lot of the technology to make it more appealing, to make it more visual, to make it more interactive, to make it more exciting. And that costs money. And in order to do that, you need to get the revenues in. And there is a sponsor market out there, and you need to start with somewhere. But yes, I can confirm that I have, at some way down the line, been converted.
Are we, just to be clear, are we? Is Giles in character as a pirate at the moment, or are we? I've lost track of which podcast we're on now. This is I don't know if it's a Dustin Hoffman method acting thing that he does. He carries around with him for weeks on end.
Yeah, I don't know about the pirate, but just to torture that metaphor some more, he's a man with many hats. Just to get back onto the point about golf's audience, but does the data tell you that there are opportunities that brands have been missing in golf? So whether, moving away from very conservative things like branding, like PAs in front of, executives and hospitality guests and that type of stuff, or does it tell you that there's a fundamentally different audience from the one that lots of sponsors have been catering to in the last few years?
Well, I'll just quickly take that, and not to hog this, but it's not that hospitality is wrong. It's not that branding is wrong. It's just it's not the most valuable currency to trade. That if you have and understand it's not about knowing your customer. It's about knowing the behaviors of customers. That's what data insight provides, and where I absolutely in the 12 years I had at the helm. Sorry to come back to different ship. Of HS, I'm getting lost now too. Of the HSBC days, we didn't really make a correlation. I'm sure they are now, but between the golf fan and therefore the bank and audience. And of course, have you do that, you've got a direct-to-consumer play, and then you're going to get real investment. And that's the opportunity. So I think this is as we've said, this is unprecedented COVID. It's a catalyst moment. It's a time for change. But actually golf, I think, sits in a position to say, change up what it's selling and celebrate the fact that the golf fan, both player and watcher, is a very valuable commodity. It's very international, and go hard to explain to the commoditized sponsor how they can reach to that consumer. And that's very interesting.
So the counter to that, and I hesitate to take Giles on this, but there is a counter argument that says that sponsorship is about big signals, and golf has traditionally traded on power signals of wealth and affluence, and those are important, and so the branding bit is important because it gives you a sort of place in that world. It's the company I keep, etc., etc. And that sort of bit of, when you look across the sports market, golf does do that very well. The challenge of the data argument is that you then start to look small. If you start to go to the bottom of the funnel, you start to interact with people via golf via digital channels, and you're popping up here, there, and everywhere in my social threads, or you're emailing me, or you've got hold of my data and you're selling me a fridge. I bought a fridge last week. You sell it again. The idea of D2C and the reality of it as it is of today is problematic, and actually golf has suffered over the course of, let's say 20 years, and it's not all Giles' fault, but over the course of 20 years, it has gone from a sort of sport that had a central place in the public consciousness to a marginal place in that consciousness. And I think that that's to do with how we watch television and sport generally, but it has suffered because it has, made some terrible sort of judgment calls around women, around race, around all of the big signals. Those are the bits that do jump out of from the avid group of golfers into the broader sort of population. And whilst I get the aspiration of the D2C aspiration, there is a sort of different view. And the other bit to it, I think, is actually what happens when for example, the Masters. We started with the Masters. So the Masters this week have made a decision. They're saying, okay, we're going to have as our leadoff guy, or next year, Lee Elder, who was the first black player to play at the Masters. Now, that is a signal which they're hoping, obviously, to sort of circumvent a story. It's incredibly cynical PR to try and get in front of Black Lives Matter and to try and respond in some way. Now, when you look at the point I'm making is that if you look at, say, for example, the BBC in the UK, it's a very UK market point, but the UK, given the choice and the limited rights budget, they went with Wimbledon over the Open, and they went and it's inescapable that they did that on the basis of the messaging that event was sending out to the broader audience. So it's not just the core audience; it's the big one. It's that big outer group, and I think golf has lost that. And I don't think the data argument is going to get that back.
And I think that the data argument is more a currency of value of interaction for sponsors. But I would absolutely agree that doesn't mean that television and that branding and that big events, they're critical. That's the staging. And I think that golf suffered a lot, particularly in the UK, from other than, many people over the age of 40 would think of golf as a BBC owned game back in the day. And obviously it then moved onto satellite a long time ago and became less part of the public consciousness. I think also sports like golf have suffered a lot from there are an awful lot of moving parts in terms of the governance of the game and who runs what. And I think for many, many years in the 90s and in the early 2000s, where it was a very splintered game, where the PGA Tour did what they wanted, the European Tour sort of tried to keep up, and then you had the RNA, etc. What I see now, and this may take a few years to come through, is that the golf hierarchy has become much more lockstep together than it ever used to be. In the last 3 or 4 years, you've got new commissioners coming in the women's game, in the men's game, etc., change at the RNA. And I think that may in time, I hope that will in time be seen through a more unified sport, because the threat to golf is not from within, it's of course from without. And I think for a long time, golf existed in its bubble thinking everything was fine. And to Richard's point, not realizing that it actually had a lot of problems that it needed to deal with. In particular, I remember, because it was at my time at HSBC and I happened to get very involved with it, which was the Open Championship being played on a number of courses which were men only, something that happily has now changed. But it was something that I think at the time the golf authorities might just hope it would go away and that they didn't have to address, rather than realizing that you have to address all of the big issues, particularly if you're trying to get the broader sports fan, which is where the real value is, where, you know, I don't necessarily watch tennis all the time, but I will watch Wimbledon and maybe the US Open, and that's part of the calendar. So I think, I hope that golf has, certainly knowing a number of the runners and riders who are involved at the top of the game, it feels very different from 10, 15 years ago in terms of sort of unilateralism.
Get the very best of SportsPro sent straight to your inbox. Head to sportspromedia.com and sign up for the SportsPro Daily. You'll get a roundup of all the biggest stories, features and opinion from our team every single morning. You'll find that all and much more at sportspromedia.com. SportsPro, connecting and inspiring the business world of sport.
It's interesting that you brought up tennis, because I spoke for the last issue of SportsPro magazine to Andrea Gaudenzi, who's the chairman at the ATP. And one of the things he talked about for tennis was that its opportunity is very big, but it comes through unity. It doesn't come through, people are not fans of specific tours. They're fans of the sport, and then they enjoy the tentpole events, and they follow the players. And it feels like golf is in a kind of similar space when it comes to, the opportunity that's out there is going to be a global one, and it's going to be a universal one.
Yeah, I mean, one question is how many you get to an athlete level and how many golfers sell tickets. There's not many, and how many it sustains an enormous number of golfers, so the European Tour and the PGA Tour. But actually, if you're really drilling down, how many golfers would the general public recognise? How do they, and let alone care about, and would they? How this is why the Premier Golf League is so such a dangerous competitor, or the idea of it is that actually the best versus the best more regularly, same old story, is a really deep threat, because actually what you've got is that the golf organisations they are owned by the players. They are member-driven organisations, so they cannot innovate in the way that the audience wants. So they are structurally incapable of giving the audience what it wants. If we all agree that if the big circle around golf, the big eventer, wants to see Rory McIlroy and Tiger Woods and Phil Mickelson on a more regular basis, Ricky Fowler, all those famous players can start to then, and they have already, and by stealth, have a calendar all their own, and that's what golf is, and that's what it looks like. The problem is that the tours cannot do that because they are owned by or they're run by people in the bottom 80, and that's the challenge.
And and Richard makes a great point, and he's bang on the money, because it is the floor to the game. And I used to feel the same as back in the day at HSBC. They put on some pretty spectacular golf tournaments around the world, and some of the best players in the world would come and play. But here's the anomaly:
because you paid them,
right? And there's the thing: if you sponsor Manchester United, you're pretty certain that you're going to get a first team rocking up every week or so. In golf, you can spend all the money in the world that you want, and HSBC did and does, but that doesn't guarantee you a field. That's an anomaly for certainly for sponsors and modern investors, because of clearly a player-run organisation is going to look after its players. And Richard's absolutely right. At any particular time, I reckon in any golf tournament or top tournament, there's probably no more than 10 to 15 players who are kind of on form, who your eye notices, and a great chunk of that then you don't notice, and it's kind of an irrelevance, and they're there playing. And so the sport is being, we're talking about the professional game here, is being supported by the form players of the time, not every player. And that, of course, then comes to how TV is produced, and why the World Match Play was so ahead of its time all those years ago when Mark McCormack set it up, I think in the 60s, I think it was, because he was just focusing on a very small field with very, very fast golf being played where every result did matter. And therefore, for all of us who used to watch it on the BBC in the 60s, 70s, 80s and 90s, it was compelling viewing because you didn't need to know much about golf to know that every match mattered.
What was it, Giles? What was it like in the HSBC office when Tiger Woods went out in the first round of the World Match Play in the first year that you sponsored it?
Well, yeah, I'm so glad you brought me up because I know you know the answer. It was the only time that Tiger Woods has played in the what was then called the HSBC World Match Play, and he did. You're quite right. We did a lot of pre-promotion. I think it may go down as the most expensive round of golf in history. And he went out, for those listeners who don't know the history of golf or this particular moment in my career, he went out on the Thursday, and Ian Carter, the venerable BBC correspondent, who's a good friend, rang me and said, I'd like to do with an interview on Friday on the breakfast show on BBC 5 Live, to which I sort of couldn't worm out of. So I said, okay then. And his opening question was exactly the one that Richard Gillis has just asked, to which I lied through my teeth and said to the world, or certainly the British public, was that HSBC believed very passionately in the power of sport and about binary results, and it was good for the game. And I have to say, it probably was good for the game, but it really wasn't good for my career.
Yeah, and well, it's funny to still be having that conversation about Tiger Woods and his performance at major events in 2020. But
well, I just go to that just quickly on Tiger, is that HSBC have a wonderful golf program, which I was lucky enough to play a part in. But it was down to Tiger Woods's magnetism, particularly at the time when the tournaments moved to China and to Abu Dhabi, and Tiger was at his pomp. It was before his own personal issues, although he's sort of come back and resurrected himself, certainly as a peon of the game. But that whole golf allure, particularly in the Far East, was down to the power of Woods. There's no doubt at all. It was extraordinary.
In terms of the golf audience more broadly, you know, we had Keith Pelly at SportsPro Live last year in the spring of 2019. And one of the points that he made is obviously there's a big rush for younger audiences, you know, to compete within that space of, you know, not even 18 to 35, but maybe 13 to 25 as well. And he said, look, we are in a position where we own the older cohort, we own the C-suite, all of that type of stuff. Can golf, bearing in mind you can create products like a golf TV, say, which is, you know, vertically targeted and all the rest of it, can golf survive with that kind of that audience profile that it has, where maybe people age into the game, people, you know, get into a point where it's the social game they can play because they don't need as many people, and it's not as intensive, and it's something that they settle into? Or does it really need? Does any sport need to be refreshed a lot more kind of vigorously than that?
I think it's an underrated position, actually. And, you know, we're obviously, you know, the marketing industry is obsessed with youth. It's, you know, and the rest of it. And we get the arguments for, you know, you get them early and they stay for life, et cetera, et cetera. But I do think it's golf's major playing card. And I guess what we don't quite know, or I don't know, is whether people do grow into golf and whether or not it's waiting for that audience. So, you know, does it need to dive after them, grab them when they're 15 and keep them for life? Or are they going to sit there and wait for them to find the game? You know, obviously I don't know the answer. I'm not sure many people do know the answer. I've not seen any data that supports that. And it goes to the broader question about then what should they do? I mean, you get the growing the game sort of mantra, which is the players. I mean, Rory McIlroy famously said, "It's not my job to grow the game," and he was right. You know, it's that's a sort of incremental impact on him playing well and being very personable and famous, that people will be attracted to the game in the same way as they were for Tiger Woods. But that's different than having a strategy and saying, right, okay, we are now today going to spend X millions of quid on digital social media products to focus on 15-year-olds, and in the hope that they move from playing computerized version of the game into actually playing the games and then becoming a sort of golf consumer in the way that our parents' generation did. Now we know that that's not going to happen. And talk to anyone at who runs resorts, or the people who, like people at Troon Golf, for example, who manage resorts. They know that that's not going to happen, or it certainly doesn't look like it's going to happen in the same numbers. So they're taking a hit more broadly. But what we don't quite know, and it's really interesting, is how then golf should sort of go after that young audience, because it feels very counterintuitive to say, no, okay, let's just be golf and wait for them to find us. But I don't know, I don't know what the implications of that would be.
Yeah, and I mean the other side of that as well is that I'm in the latter half, the older half of the millennial generation.
Really?
Yeah, and I am aware of just anecdotally, I'm aware of friends going off to start playing golf more regularly, more seriously, and people I've worked with and so on. And I don't know the extent to which that is seeded culturally, and it's the idea that this is now a social thing that you do, or whether it's seeded by the fact that, when I was a teenager, Tiger Woods was at his peak, and a generation before that, it's people watching Seve Ballesteros play. And, how much of that, even if it is a game that people grow into, how much of it is seeded through television, through media, and through an exposure to the game at a much earlier age.
But I think one of the things I think that many sports are all battling with this is of the various generations, and particularly youngsters. I don't think you have to take a single view of how you recruit. I think Keith Pelly was quite right. He's got a wonderful audience as over 40s and C-suite, and they should absolutely go after that. But I think every sport needs to figure out how to engage and interact with young people. And those of us who are parents, we bemoan our children sort of endlessly on their Xboxes or whatever, and we want to get them off their backsides. I certainly have that feeling from time to time. And then I realised that, of course, in the modern world, kids want a bit of both, which is they want the virtual and the virtual and the real and reality coming together. And golf is a game that has always been about technology, right from when clubs were made and angles and lofts. It's always been a high technology game. And I think one of the ways that they should continue to look at trying to grow participation is to embrace the technology that already exists, businesses like Clips, and then obviously some of the big businesses already out there, of which, let's be honest, Top Golf has done a great job, which is make it into a virtual and physical experience. Is a very, very potent way. You're seeing it in other sports as well. Tennis is doing it. There's a number of sports which are trying to embrace the technology, not to become couch potato land, but to try and blend the two. It's early days, but golf actually responds very well to technology. It always has, because it's a game of statistics anyway. It allows for technology. And once, even on TV, once you started to see technology creeping in, it really changed up, I think, a lot of the TV viewing, made it much more exciting. A little bit like when tennis got into Hawkeye, and that Hawkeye is now part and parcel of the whole tennis experience. But at the beginning, I'm sure there were those who were naysayers. So the trouble is, and Richard said a lot of this, it's not actually the tour's responsibility to recruit youngsters to play. It's the USGA, it's the RNA, and they're working hard at it. But they need to continue to do that very quickly, because you need to grab that audience, all of the audiences. It's just been, for me, delightful, even though I'm probably the only person this year who's actually resigned his golf course membership and given up the game because I'm so bad at it. I might be the only one, but it is encouraging that more and more people have been playing golf this year.
I think there's quite a few people wanting you to give up, Giles.
It's so true.
I mean, we've talked around it for pretty much the whole podcast, but this the $2 billion acquisition of Topgolf by Callaway, which went through a couple of weeks ago. You know, Topgolf obviously being this virtual driving range chain, big success story in the game. But one of the things is that you could characterize this, Richard, as a democratization of golf, and obviously you can put a Topgolf in places you can't put a golf course or even a driving range. But at the same time, I was struck by what Callaway's chief exec, Chip Brewer, said about the deal, which was that, you know, they had ambitions about becoming the Peloton of golf. And Peloton, there are cheaper ways to ride an exercise bike than to get a Peloton. You know, it's still kind of got that aspirational gloss to it. You know, so is this a question of modernizing how you reach the same audience, or is it a question of creating a new one?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the breakdown. I mean, the Topgolf themselves say that and their data suggests that 49% of the people that go are golfers, and so obviously 51% are not golfers, and so that's that. You put this and into a product set, as you say, it's sort of in that Peloton Zwift sort of thing going on. There's park run and CrossFit in here as well, in terms of a feeling that easy access at the bottom end and taking the fear away from some of the barriers that stop people from playing golf are removed. So there's a lot to like about it, and it's not new either. I mean, I remember I think one of my first sort of trips out of the sport business office in about sort of 2000 was with Michael Pask, who I know Giles knows well, for IMG, and he took me to the one in Watford, and we sort of mucked about there for a couple of hours under the guise of editorial research, and it was great. And it's been around for 20 years odd, and I think the sort of the sell of it, as I say, you're right into that. I can imagine you can sort of sit there and think, okay, the pitch of this, I would imagine a Peloton sort of slide, a park run slide. You're seeing one of the things that Callaway has faced is in the core market for golf equipment. Obviously, it's a golf equipment seller. It makes golf clubs, and that's pretty hard graft at the moment. And has been for a while, not helped by their own business model. You've had Nike and Adidas come into that market over the last 20 years and then exit that market because they weren't making enough money. And you've got a sort of marketing story that is obsessed with distance. So golfers, it's like a sort of Viagra marketing approach of, we will, you get longer and longer, whatever driver you sort of you buy. Complete nonsense, of course, but they're bringing out sort of 3 or 4 new drivers a year, and so they're educating their own customers to ignore them, essentially. So Callaway, this makes complete sense from what I can see, because it gives them a route to market. They've always supplied the clubs, I think, to Topgolf, so it gives them a sort of a presence. It allows them to sell stuff to directly. There is a sort of element of a D2C sort of play here. They're going to get a whole load of customer data that they presumably didn't have already. So there's lots of good reasons I can see from Callaway's perspective for doing this. It shouldn't be forgotten, though, that actually this is both a positive step, but it's also a sort of a bit of a reverse ferret to try and negate some of the really significant challenges they have in their core market, which is flogging golf stuff.
Giles, I mean, to what extent is this of a piece with what you might see in golf coverage as well, where the Masters app, which is going to be in widespread use this week, you can follow a specific group. It's something that other broadcasters have been playing around with. That might not necessarily be something that brings new players into the game, but it definitely is something that kind of that richly serves the audience that's already there. and you get to learn a little bit more about them perhaps in the process. To what extent is this a shift to a new target market for golf, and to what extent is it a different way of serving the existing one?
Well, I think the Augusta app, like the Wimbledon tennis app, both they're very close as organisations. They're both cutting edge, and they're two of the greatest events you could argue on the global calendar certainly for their sports, but maybe even just globally. The apps serve two purposes, which are incredibly important. One, they engage the fan, and they provide the fan with all of the information and hopefully the color that they need to enjoy that experience, which of course is something that rights holders should be doing. But also what it does is allows them to understand their fan better. One of the problems that most sports have is that they claim to know their fan, but they don't. And when I say know it, I mean understand the behavior, understand where they live, what age they are, what gender are they, what are their habitats, what brands do they like, where do they like to, how do they like to live? Because that, of course, is the currency that sponsors want to get hold of, as indeed do investors, private equity, private investors, etc. So therefore, it's incredibly important that all sports follow this, which is the more that you can own your fan engagement, particularly digitally, and then put great creative around it with digital execution, is that one, you're giving your fans something more, but secondly, you're getting more information to understand how to fight the future. Because this is a sport that for many years, certainly in the many years at HSBC that I was involved with the game, people were talking about the future of golf, and goodness knows HSBC published reports on that. And the truth is the sport needs to ensure that it's weatherproof for the future. And the way you start by doing that is understanding your audience, truly understanding your audience. And technology allows you that ability to do so, to then start to make plans about how you're going to, what are the demographics? Where do you need to go? PumpJack DataWorks that I'm very involved with are based in Dallas, actually in Fort Worth. And there is a Top Golf in Fort Worth in Dallas. And it's on if you like, the wrong side of town. And it's mobbed. It's mobbed all the time by people who would never in a million years have normally got, certainly to the private members golf club. This is a kind of democratization of the game. And if any of those golfers who are enjoying the Top Golf experience are then moving on to other forms and taking up the more traditional form of golf, then brilliant. It's a means to an end. But what this sport needs to do is to understand first its consumer base, to then figure out how to engage the new and also protect the existing.
Richard, what kind of developments would you be looking out for in golf over the next couple of years in 21 and 22?
I think that we will see some shifts in the product as a television product. I think there's sort of too much money has been spent by people like Discovery to enter this market, not to sort of want some substantial return. I think there's outside of the States, I think we're going to see quite a lot of change. I don't think, I've mentioned the Premier Golf League a few times. I've got no skin in that game, but I do think it's an interesting idea. I did think it scared the game and the people who run the game, and I think that they're under real pressure, and they won't, because structurally they won't be able to respond to it. It's quite a fascinating case study in sport, actually. And I think that, if we then apply the trends that we're seeing elsewhere, private equity coming in, audience behaviours changing, all of it, golf is in the mix. I quite often say, though, that other sports would love golf's problems.
Yeah, Richard said that to me before, actually, and I agree. Most, to be an Olympic sport, to have men and women playing, where you can start at the age of 4 and go until to 92. There are very few sports like golf in terms of you can play on the most holy grail or the most holy turf, which is St Andrews, and as a public course. Very few sports have this opportunity, but what it has to do is embrace its very unique diaspora of both participants and fans, understand them, so that investors, both sponsor investors, private investors, the business of sport, can reinvest in itself to make it reach out to both keep the traditional audience fuzzy and warm, but also reach out to new audiences. And that's the opportunity. And that the more that the powers that be in the game can speak with one voice, rather than many voices will help the sport enormously.
Guys, thanks very much for your time. Enjoyed that.
Thank you. Unofficial Partner is a better podcast than this, but in the meantime, this was very pleasurable.
But you're both very welcome to come on the captain's table. We'll have a long, hard sail somewhere.
Yeah, aggressive plugs at the end. Thank you very much to Richard Gillis.
Thank you.
And to Giles Morgan.
Thank you very much, Owen.
And thanks to all of you for listening. We'll be back again very soon. Bye-bye.
The SportsPro podcast is published by SportsPro Media. The producer is Ed Dixon.